This morning we're going to talk a little bit about starting seeds indoors. The more you do it, the better you get at it. But if you follow a few of the things that we'll talk about, you'll have great success. This morning we're going to talk about starting seeds indoors. The reason you want to start seeds indoors is there are many plants that you can get a big head start on for your garden or your flower border. And so let's talk about the basics of seed starting. First off, there are two things that seeds need to get started. The first thing is moisture, and we'll supply the moisture by using a seed starting mix and putting them in a tray. And the other thing that you're going to need is a warmth, because the seeds germinate better when the soil temperature is around 68 to 72 degrees, and we're going to show you how you're going to get that. So let's start out with the seed starting mix. The first thing you should remember is that garden soil should never be used when you're starting seeds, because the garden soil contains some damping off microorganisms that love the same conditions that seed starting has. So if you have a moist, warm condition and you have garden soil in your mix, the spores of those microorganisms will also germinate in the soil and damp the seeds off. So let's talk about the soil that you want. First thing you want is a sterile soil. The two that we recommend are Jiffy mix, which is a mixture of peat moss, perlite, and some other nutrients so that the plants can get off to a good start. We've also created our own Jung starting mix, which has about the same amount of nutrients, but it has a little compost in it and will also start your seeds very well. The first thing we'd want to do is we want to take the Jiffy mix or the Jung seed starting mix and put it in a clean container. New plastic work really well. If you're not going to use new plastic, a milk jug would work really well, but what you want to do with that milk jug is be sure you punch holes in the bottom and cut the top off so that the seedlings can come up. The second thing you want to do is put that in a closed environment. So if you're using a milk jug or you're using a flat like this, you can either purchase a dome that fits on top of the flats that keeps the moisture in that area, keeps the moisture, the humidity up, which will get the seed swelling and starting, or you want to put it in a plastic bag. The second thing that we talked about was putting it on in a hot area. One of the things that we sell is this seedling heat mat, and you simply have to plug it in. It has its own thermostat. You put the flat on top of it. It keeps that soil warm so that the seeds come up very fast and very uniformly. Because your house is at 72 degrees, it doesn't mean that your soil will stay at 72 degrees. It will probably be much colder, and the seedlings will be much slower in coming up, and there will be more of a chance of the damping off to get going. So if you want optimum conditions for starting your seeds, what you want to do is, like I said, use a clean container, put the Jiffy mix in it, and it's a good idea with the starting mixes to put them in a container and you put the water in and mix the water into the mixture, because with Jiffy mix it doesn't go into the medium real easily, and then you wring it out. You want the medium like a wrung out sponge. Put it into the container in a nice flat on top of it. We also have some seed starting trays where you have different compartments where you can put different varieties of seeds in. One thing you want to remember though is when you're starting something in a container, you don't want to be starting a lot of different things in it. If you're going to start a lot different tomatoes, that's fine. But if you're starting peppers and tomatoes and eggplants, you want a separate container for each, because each comes up at a different rate. So you put the container either with a dome on top of it, which are purchased at through the catalog or through the garden center. That dome will keep the atmosphere underneath it, keep the humidity high. What you'll see is that the water will condense on the cover and fall back in, so that if you have your Jiffy mix or your seed starting mix at the right consistency, you won't have to water until when you remove the seeds from this moist environment. After you remove the seedlings from that moist, warm environment, you get them off the seed starting mat, put them in a cool, sunny window. You want to feel the medium. So when the medium is dry, you water it, and you water it heavy, and you let it dry out between waterings. You don't want to water on a daily schedule. You just want to water it when it needs it, and then you water it heavy so that you don't have to water real often. The reason for that is that those damping off microorganisms can get started even if you use a Jiffy mix or a Jung seed starting mix. So you want to water them heavy, let them dry out between waterings. Okay, when the seedlings get to about this stage, and we've started these in plug trays, when they get 2 or 3 sets of true leaves, now you can transplant them into a mix that contains garden soil. And the mix that we used in the greenhouse was 1/3 sand, 1/3 peat moss or compost, and 1/3 garden soil. It made a great starting mix. And to that mix we added Osmocote, which is a plastic encapsulated fertilizer, and that gives the plants a little bit of fertility every time you water them. And so that gives them that fertility, gets them off to a good start, so that when the plants are ready to be moved outside, they've had the growing conditions that they really need to do well. Now, when do I start my seeds? A lot of people ask me that, and we put that on the seed packets. We use that as a guide. For instance, this is a petunia, and a petunia takes a little bit longer than a tomato or a pepper or eggplant. It tells you it takes about 10 to 12 weeks from the time you sow the seed to the time that you can plant them out. So you have to back up on a calendar, and that's when you start them. In this area, we can start planting seeds outdoors in mid-May if you're willing to cover them. So when the seedlings get to this stage, you just take a pencil and you tease them out. You put them into another container. Now, one of the containers that we recommend at Jung's are the peat pots. The reason these work really well is that you can plant these right in the soil, and they will decompose as the plant is growing. In fact, the roots will go right through them. So other things that you can use are styrofoam cups, but remember you have to punch a hole in the bottom so that the excess water moves through. You can use plastic drink containers. This peat pot is also very good for seeds that you start directly, such as the vine crops like cucumbers, melons, squash if you want to start them early. It gets it off to a good start, and in our area, if you want to get watermelons ripe, you almost have to start them in peat pots because it takes so long to get them ripe. So peat pot works beautifully for that. You start the seeds in late April, early May, and when the vine is about 4 inches tall, it's ready to plant outside, and you've got a head start on it. If you plant it out early, you may have to cover it to protect it from the frost, but it works really, really well. One of the things you have to remember when you're planting the plants outdoors is that you have to harden them off, because the plants are used to no wind in an environment where the temperature is quite stable, and they will have a little bit of a shock going outside. So what we recommend is that you take the plants outside during the day for about a week before you transplant them, and then bring them indoors at night so that the cold weather doesn't bother them. Another easy way to start plants directly in the container that you're planting them in is Jiffy 7s. These are pellets that you put in water. They expand to 7 times their size. You just put a little divot in the top of the peat pellet, and you put 2 or 3 seeds in there. You put them in the same conditions, the moist conditions, in a clean flat, in a warm spot where they get started. And once they're started, you take them out of that condition. You grow them on. If you've got 2 or 3 seedlings in a peat pot, you want to clip 2 of them off so that all you have is 1 plant per peat pellet. You'd follow the same procedure. You let them grow on until you're ready to plant out. Now, one other thing that I wanted to talk about with seed starting is that it's a good idea to have a notebook. The notebook, you can write down the varieties that you're using so that if you have a good variety, you have good luck with it, you know what thing to order next year. The other thing you do with it is if the seeds are too tall or too far along when you plant them out, start them a little later. If they're not big enough, then you can note in that notebook that you want to start them earlier. Some of the seeds that you can start directly, like in a pellet or in a peat pot, are things like cabbage and tomatoes. Tomatoes would start relatively easy, but things like eggplants and peppers and most of your flower seeds should be started in a warm, moist environment to get them off to a good start, and then you transplant them into a container. When you're growing plants in a cool, sunny window, if they start to get too leggy, it's because of one of 3 things. They're either too warm, they're either too close together, or you're fertilizing them too much. So there again, in your notebook, if you want to get nice compact plants, you want to depend on the osmocote that we put in the seed growing on mixture, or if you are watering them and putting fertilizer in the water, that you only go about half strength. That will keep your plants nice and compact, and so when you plant them out, they're in good shape. Another thing when you're planting out your seedlings, if the seedlings are starting to get too big, you can pinch the top out. It'll also make the plant grow a lot thicker. More of the buds will break and you'll have a much nicer plant too. So even if they're not too leggy, if you pinch that center bud out, it will cause them to branch and you'll have a much nicer display. With tomatoes, if they're too tall, what you want to do is create a trench and plant the stem horizontally, and then just bring the last 2 or 3 sets of leaves out of the ground pointing up. If you have any other questions on starting seeds, talk to one of our seed experts at Jung Garden Centers or call our customer service line. If you enjoyed this video, hit the subscribe button and like us. This is Dick Zondag, the Garden Doctor.